I looked up that word for you, and that word over there that several of you asked in Isaiah should have been tohu rather than bohu. So I'm sorry, I made a mistake in giving you the wrong word. That way we still end up with the same number of times. Bohu is used 3 times, always in connection with tohu. Doesn't change anything, you still end up with the same meaning in Isaiah 45:18. God couldn't populate the world with inhabitants until he had first, of course, formed it. So you still end up with the same meaning if you change the word. Thus far, we have covered 2 of these theories on theistic evolutionism. We've looked at the day-age theory and the gap theory. 2 of them, and it's taken us several weeks to cover those first 2, but we're going to do the final 3 all here in just a few moments because they're not as popular or as prevalent as those first 2 we covered, the day-age theory and the gap or the pre-Adamite or pre-Adamic theory or ruin and reconstruction theory. Therefore, since they're not as popular, not as detailed, we can cover them rather quickly. So we're on our 3rd theory then here under theistic evolutionism, and that 3rd theory is known as the geological break theory. We've touched on this a little bit before and saying some things about it. The geological break theory does hold that each one of these days in Genesis 1 are literal 24-hour days, but they're not consecutive. In other words, in between each one of these literal 24-hour days, we have a geological break, maybe 1,000,000 years. In other words, you're still ending up with the same thing, enough time for evolution to have taken place. So it's a little bit different than the gap theory. The gap theory basically is putting that gap just between Genesis 1 and 2. And it's different than the day-age theory because the day-age theory equates each one of these days symbolically, the day itself, with a long period or age or eon of time. But here in our 3rd theory, the geological break theory, we have literal 24-hour days, but not only do we have a gap after one of the days, or as they say, between the first 2 verses, we have a geological break or gap between each one of these days. How long, we don't know. We just know it's a long period, million, billion years, however much time we need between these days to fit evolution in. What do we have to say about that? Nothing at all, because we don't have any evidence for that in the Bible, so there's no sense in making any comment about it. It makes it rather simple, doesn't it? See, they think they have some evidence for the gap theory. We don't even have any evidence for there being a gap in between the days. Purely, friends, an invention of men. Fourthly, the vision day theory. Very interesting theory here. The vision day theory. These 6 days are 24 hours. They're literal and they're consecutive. But they are days from Moses' point of view rather than God's point of view. That's where we get the name vision day theory. How did Moses find out about all these things in Genesis 1? Well, God revealed it to him by means of a vision. Now, God's never saying here that he created the things in a day. That day there is in reference to Moses, and on day 1, he would have gotten, the first 5 verses. And then Moses would say himself, now the evening and the morning were the first day. Another real sneaky way to get around it. And all he'd be saying is, God revealed to me the first 5 verses on day 1. Literal 24-hour day. Then on day 2, I would have gotten verses 6 through 8. And so forth. Right on down the line. That way they're not really tampering with the text here. They're just interpreting it according to how they want to interpret it. We leave our 24-hour days, we leave them literally like that and consecutively, just like we find in Genesis 1. But we just change the point of reference back to Moses rather than the initial creation period. There are 2 things we can say about this. First of all, it's rather ridiculous that it would take God a full day just to say 5 verses. Because Moses does say the evening and the morning. That meant it took all day long for God to read verses 1 to 5 to Moses. Or more than that, just show it to him in a vision. He'd just have to show him the word in and wait about a half an hour. Come along again and show the. And then another 15 minutes, come along and show the word beginning. And so forth. Well, you see, that's just ridiculous. That's ludicrous there. As a matter of fact, if this was dictated to him, which it could have been, we're not saying that it is, but the proponents of this theory say that this was dictated to Moses. Just assuming that this was dictated to him by God, and Moses had to sit down and write it down, I had it dictated to me just for a point of reference here, and it took me 18 minutes to write all of Genesis 1, verses 1 to 31. And that's with no anointing either. I mean, I wasn't inspired to write Scripture then. I could have written faster. Maybe you can write faster. I know I can write the whole chapter in 18 minutes. That is, someone telling it to you, pausing long enough for you to write it down. Obviously, I had her do it to me, and she read it. This is many months ago. I was getting this ready. It took me 18 minutes to write it, but it took Moses 6 days to write that. I mean, that's pretty slow, I would say. Another thing we could say about this that really destroys the whole theory, if these days now aren't referring to God's days, they're referring to days when Moses is writing this, then Moses couldn't have known that God was resting on the seventh day because God wouldn't be telling him anything on that day. Now, how could he say this is the evening and the morning of the seventh day when God was resting? And he didn't know what was going on that day because God was silent the seventh day of this. I don't think we need to comment any more on that silly conjecture of men. Now, he could know that God rested on the seventh day if these are days from God's point of reference, because God would have told him. Now, I want to tell you what I did way back there on the seventh day. I rested on that day. But under Moses' time, after the evening of that sixth day, silence would have happened all the seventh day. He would have known what was going on the seventh day. And there would have been silence on the eighth and the ninth day. And he'd have no idea when God was through. He'd have to just sit there from now until the end of eternity to wait and see, is he ever going to pick back up and say, now, this is what I did after the sixth day. We would have been in the dark, in other words. Moses would have been in the dark. The third theory is known as the dependent clause theory. What this attempts to do is make Genesis 1 and verse 1 a dependent clause rather than an independent clause. And if this is true, then we're going to have our gap placed before Genesis 1:1 rather than after Genesis 1:1. And this, by the way, is what Merle Unger does. He has studied all of these things out, and he sees that you can't believe in the gap theory by putting the gap after Genesis 1:1. And he's about one of the only ones that I've ever heard of who still believes in a gap theory, but he believes in the dependent clause theory interpretation of Genesis 1:1. And in doing this, he can go back and put the gap before the first verse of the Bible rather than after the first verse of the Bible. Now, if this is a dependent clause, then you can translate this first verse one of several ways. And I want to give these to you. I'm saying if this first sentence is a dependent clause, in the beginning, especially these words, in the beginning God created. If this is an independent clause, then there are several ways that we can correctly translate this in English. First of all, we could translate it, when God began to create the heaven and the earth in the beginning. You'll see in all these cases it's trying to get the word when in there. When God began to create the heaven and the earth in the beginning. Another way we could have it is in the beginning when God created the heaven and the earth. One version of the Bible actually translates it this second way here. I forget which version that is. I think it's the RV actually translates it this way, in the beginning when God created the heaven and the earth. Now, to believe that this is a dependent clause and to translate it in either one of these two ways or other ways that it could be done, all trying to put the word when in there, and if you can, get the word began in there, then there's two major implications of this dependent clause theory. First of all, a dependent clause interpretation of Genesis 1:1 rules out completely creatio ex nihilo. Severe implication because it rules out the doctrine of creation out of nothing. How do we know that? Well, you go back to either one of those ways I just gave you, where it could be translated when God began to create the heaven and the earth in the beginning, or in the beginning when God created the heaven and the earth. And we've got an implication that it took some time to do whatever he was doing here. When we say when God began to create the heaven and the earth, well, evidently, see what they're trying to do. The only reason they've gone back there and translated it that way, when, in the beginning, when God began to create the heaven and the earth, is to leave us room for evolution there. It didn't say that God did it like in 6 days or 7 days, but it talks about in the beginning when he began to do this. And it took some time. Namely, it took about 4 billion years for him to do it. And that way, if it doesn't just leave in the beginning as an absolute statement and as referring to the absolute beginning when he did it, and when he did it in 6 days and rested on the seventh, then we have room for believing in some form of evolution. Another thing, another problem, another implication that this leaves us with is that we have the problem of already having this great watery mass before God's creating work began. Now just look at verses 1 and 2 and you'll see this. We're going to already have this watery mass before God ever starts his creating. Because what we'd have, and of course what that amounts to now is pantheism, dualism. We've got the co-eternal existence of matter with God, which of course is unscriptural. We would have in Genesis 1:1-2, in the beginning, when God began to create the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And then the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. In the beginning, when God began to do this, he already had a great watery mass, and he just simply began to work on that, made something out of that. And that's dualism. Remember, we covered that back in atheistic evolutionism. That's dualism, saying that this watery mass, it's simply matter, whatever form of matter, it's still matter, has been co-eternal and coexistent with God. And it's rather strange, it's bold, I should say, for some versions to actually translate this verse as a dependent clause, because then, there again, they are allowing room for the belief in evolution. Well, it should be rather obvious, if you know any language, that verse 1 is strictly an independent clause. It's not dependent on verse 2. As a matter of fact, as we've already shown you before, verse 2 is dependent on verse 1. Verse 2 is the clause that is subordinate to and explanatory of verse 1. So if anything's subordinate, it's going to be verse 2 to verse 1, and certainly not verse 1 to verse 2 or verse 1 to anything else. Now, if it was subordinate to anything else, that would make it dependent upon that sentence, and that would make it a dependent clause. But that's not true. It is strictly an independent clause. The dependent clause, as I said, would read, in the beginning when God began to create the heaven and the earth, then the earth was without form and void. And he already had an earth to work with here. If this is when he simply began to do his creating work. Really, we'd end up again with his recreating work, because he's already got something here that he can work with. So those are simply the three final views of theistic evolutionism. Now we're through with that. We've got several more messages that we're going to begin with here this evening, simply on summing up all that we've said on evolution and looking at some flaws and some fallacies in the various theories of evolution. which will basically go back to atheistic evolutionism, even though, of course, it would include what we've said in theistic evolutionism. Let me give you some conclusions now regarding theistic evolutionism. First of all, the Genesis account is the only reliable account of the origin of all things. That's a simple statement, but not very many people are believing that today. Not science, not anyone's opinions or views. The Genesis account is the only complete and completely reliable account of the origin of all things. You don't find it in Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. You find it in Genesis 1, verses 1 to 31. You have an elaboration of that in Genesis 2, but the initial account is still found in the first 31 verses of the Bible. These constitute the first chapter, Genesis 1. This is the only reliable account. So just it shouldn't bother you what you read in the newspaper or what the astronomers or the scientists are saying. This is the only complete, reliable, original account of the origin of all things. And it either lines up with this or it doesn't. So you can either believe it on the basis of this or disbelieve it, unbelief. Put your unbelief in there on what the scientists say. Secondly, the Genesis account is not myth. It's not poetry. But it is a straightforward historical account which is to be understood prima facie. It's not myth, poetry, it's not ancient saga. It is a straightforward historical account. Some have tried to explain it away by saying, well, that's poetry and you can't interpret everything literally in poetry, which is true. You can't interpret all poetry literally. But this is not poetry. This is a straightforward historical account that is to be understood prima facie. That's a Latin word that means at first glance. What was your first belief whenever you just read Genesis? Would you get the gap theory? You wouldn't get that. Would you get the geologic break theory? No, you wouldn't get that. You have to be taught those things. And if you read this prima facie, the only thing you get is, well, God made everything in 6 days and he rested on the seventh day. It's the only thing you can get from it. That's why we insist that it must be read as a straightforward historical account. And whenever you read it, then take it for what it says, prima facie. Thirdly, verses 1 to 31 of Genesis 1 cover a period of 6 literal consecutive 24-hour days and no gaps between any of them. Covers a period of 6 literal consecutive 24-hour days. No gaps may be found between any of the days. Fourthly, theistic evolutionism in any of the above 5 forms is an atheistic philosophy of rationalism, which makes an unnecessary attempt to reconcile Scripture with the theories of science. Theistic evolutionism. We've called it theistic because they say that they believe in God. But now you see what we're really calling it. We're calling it, that's atheism. Theistic evolutionism in any of the above 5 forms or any other forms that we haven't mentioned is an atheistic philosophy of rationalism, based on rationalism, not based on faith. See, you see what they're doing, friends? They're trying to be able to prove when God did it and how he did it. They're trying to be able to prove that. And Hebrews 11:3 says, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. We can't prove that he did that. We're not trying to prove that he ever did that. If you get to the place where you can prove it, you don't need Hebrews 11:3 and faith anymore then, do you? No, we're not making an attempt to prove it, and that's what they're striving their best to do, is somehow reconcile Scripture with the theories of science, with the theories of astronomy, with the theories of geology. And that's all they are. They're not facts or theories, but they're trying an attempt to prove that there are breaks in between there, or that there are not breaks in between there. And bless God, friends, that's where some of your creationist groups, I could say all of them have gone off the deep end. That's unscriptural to form a group and call yourself a creation society. And they're working just as hard as the atheists are. They're working just as hard to prove to everyone that these things are true. We simply can't do that. You either believe it or you don't believe it. Now, sure, we can go and point out some inconsistencies in what the atheistic people say, what the evolutionists have to say, but we can't prove that our position is right. Why? No one was there. None of us lived on those 6 days. Now, if I lived there, I might could prove to you from first-hand accounts that this actually took only 6 days, and I could have photographed all of it and got it on, we could have recorded God's voice on a tape player then, and you would hear him say, "Let there be light," and you'd know that God actually did it that way. But we're not trying to make an attempt to prove any of these things. I'm not trying to prove them to you. It's something that you must believe and accept by faith. To go over that one again, theistic evolutionism in any of the above 5 forms is an atheistic philosophy of rationalism which makes an unnecessary attempt. You don't even need to. This is unneedful, unnecessary. Attempt to reconcile Scripture with the theories of science. And you can put science in quotation marks because remember, if it's not an observable fact or demonstrable truth, then it's not science. It's religion and philosophy all over again. So they can't call what they're saying science. Not if they go to their own dictionary, not even a Christian dictionary, just a Webster's or an Oxford dictionary. And they'll tell you what science is. And if it's science, it has to be either be able to prove it or to demonstrate it. Observe it or demonstrate it. You can't do either one of those things. You can't do that for creation. You can't do that for evolution. Both of them are a religion. Both of them are a philosophy, if you want to call it that. They're both a philosophy. And you have the choice which one you want to believe. Fifthly, belief in any of the aforementioned theories is in direct disobedience to 1 Timothy 6 and verse 20. See, if we had someone say, well, would you let us bring in an expert on evolution and would you debate him on evolution and creation? No, I wouldn't. Scripture forbids debate. And I get a lot of the literature from these creation societies, and they pride themselves. The one I get from California, they spend half of their newsletter, more than half of their newsletter, broken up into little segments. Dr. So-and-so was able to debate Dr. So-and-so at such and such university. And they'll tell you what points they each presented. And then it goes, the next article say, and Dr. such and such debated creation versus evolution at another university. And we think that such and such won. And they just go on and on and on. One doctor, that is a Christian doctor, not a medical doctor, a Christian doctor in geology or something, is debating a doctor that believes in evolution that has his doctorate in geology also, or astronomy or whatever it might be. And they are debating each other. And, of course, that Christian that's doing that, thinking that he's doing God's service. Tell the world about what Genesis 1 to 11 really says. And we're not called to tell the world that. We're called to teach that to Christians. Jesus said that in Matthew 28:19. He said, go make disciples and then teach the world. No, teach those disciples that you just made. Matthew 28:18 to 20. Very clear there. Go and make disciples first, and once you've got disciples, then he says, now teach them what the Word says. But don't spin your wheels and waste your time trying to teach the world or debate things on university campuses just so you look like Mr. Intellectual incarnate yourself. Well, you can turn over to 1 Timothy 6:20. I said belief in any of these theories is in direct disobedience to what he said in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 20. Trying to prove these things one way or another is also in contradiction to what he said here in the same verse. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called. They're not real opposition, nor is it real science. And that's why he said they're falsely called that. They're not opposition. I mean, someone can say, now, I believe that that black object is white. That's no opposition to the fact that it's really white, though. They can just say that all they want to. That's no opposition, though. It's nothing that we even have to be concerned about. If it's white, it's still white. Now, he can say it's black all he wants to. I just wish people would confront the Word the same way, that it's that simple to understand. Now, they can say that's not true, and they can say that all they want to. But that doesn't make it untrue. The word used here, it's not really science, it's the word that we get our word knowledge from, but it's just using science in a broad sense because that's what science claims to be, is the authoritative knowledge on all different areas. Whether it's medical science, you see, they put the word after that, medical science, medical knowledge, in other words, is what they're saying. But it's not knowledge. You can't have knowledge of something that's not true. That's called deception. That's not called knowledge. So if they're talking about the knowledge they have on how old the earth is, it's 4 billion years old, that's not knowledge. You can't know something that doesn't exist, in other words. You see what I'm saying? You can't know something that doesn't exist. And if you think that you know it and it doesn't exist, that's called deception. And that's where most people are. So that's 5 conclusions to theistic evolutionism. Now let's begin looking at some fallacies of evolution in general. Just look at some of these common sense fallacies of evolution tonight, and if we've got time next week, we want to get into looking at some of these scriptural fallacies of evolution. It should never have been allowed to gain the stronghold that we see it having today, but nonetheless, it's been able to do that very thing. So we want to look at some flaws in the theory of evolution, some fallacies in this theory. And we've got, a dozen or so points here tonight to look at to begin with. First of all designs must have a designer. Real simple here. Now, we're just beginning with some simple common sense ones. All designs must have a designer. One of the arguments that some of the ancient church fathers used to prove that God was the one who created the world. And very elaborate, and we'll deal with that in some other class, very elaborate philosophy in showing exactly this very thing, that all things that resemble having any type of design must have had a designer. You can take this building, look at everything in here. There's not a thing in this building that doesn't have a design to it. Everything in here has a design to it. What do we know about everything in this building? I mean, everything in here. A designer made it. All different types of designers. But we would never look at one thing in this building and say, that has been here forever. No, simply because we see that it has a design, we know that an intelligent designer had to be behind that object, or he could not have made that design. Now, when we go outside, we see a tree, that thing had to have a beginning too. None of us look at the tree, the grass, the birds, and say, well, they've been here forever. No, we see that tree, it had a beginning from another tree. And that tree had its beginning from another tree. And it's got a particular, peculiar design to it, just like everything we confront here in our material world. Now, why is it that we can say, well, those things out there didn't have a designer, but everything in here does have a designer? That's illogical. You can't believe something like that. Everything that we know as a human that has a design has a designer, therefore we can correctly assume that everything out there in the world also had a designer. In other words, we can logically apply this to creation into the universe. Secondly, life can never arise from a non-living source. I've heard it said to and of the evolutionists before. It's rather interesting. We can give them a dead man. You see, they're saying that we actually came from non-living matter in the beginning. We can give them, and they will admit that the most highly developed thing in the world, as far as living substances is concerned, is the human being. Now, we can actually give him, a human being, that most highly developed thing, after it's been dead for 30 minutes, let's say by electrocution, after it's been dead for 30 minutes by electrocution, it actually was a living substance, the greatest living thing here on the earth. You know what? He can never make that thing come back to life again. Now, if we can actually give him the final product there, I mean, we've all evolved. The whole process has been so that man could evolve from all these things. If we can actually give him the final process, the thing that he's always talking about, how man has come from these things, and kill that man for him, now rather than starting with that amoeba, we're going to let him start with the full-grown human. All he's got to do is get some life back in him. He can't do that. Can't do that. We're going to get him what he needs. I mean, that must take a lot of faith or deception, one or the other, to think that you could evolve from an amoeba. But just offer one of them a human and say you'll give him $100,000 if he can get that thing to live again. Or get him one that's been dead 10 years. It doesn't matter how long they've been dead. As long as they're dead, I mean by electrocution, I don't mean that their heart stops beating. That doesn't mean that they're dead. You can just, by artificial resuscitation, get the thing going again. I'm talking about someone that's D-E-A-D, dead. Get him that thing. And say, now, if you're such an authority on how we all evolved from non-living matter, I'll give you the rest of your life to get that man to live again. And all he'll get is a stinking corpse there in his laboratory. It'll just make him more the aggravated because he won't be able to get rid of the smell. Psalm 90 and verse 2. Only one thing's live forever. What's that? No one knows? What's Psalm 90 and 2 verse say? Only one substance has lived forever. God. Psalm 90 and verse 2. We got someone thinking back on the back row there. Many verses say that. Just the way I worded it's what threw you off, I guess. God is the only thing. I didn't want to say person because he's not a person. He's a substance. And if I said, what's the only spirit, then I knew you'd guess that. So I had to use the word thing there that's lived forever. And that's God. Only one. Only thing. He didn't come from living matter or from dead matter. He didn't come from any type of matter. He is totally outside of matter himself. He has no matter. Thirdly, now this is something, unless you've done some study, I had some questions brought up to me earlier after one of the teachings many weeks ago, and I just hadn't gotten this far. Someone that knows a little bit more in this area, and that concerns mutation, because the scientists always tell us that it's by a process of mutation that things have evolved. And you have mutations, and then you have a slow and gradual change there. Something occurred after that mutation. Then in a billion years later, or 100,000 years later, you have another mutation. And it goes from the amoeba on up through your fish, your reptiles, your birds, your mammals, all the way up to your humans. But what do we have to say about mutations? And if you read the scientists, they'll tell you that this is true, because it's a proven fact in today's world. Mutations have an adverse effect 99% of the time. Mutations never make anything better. They always make something worse. I mean, you read about mutations in humans, mutations in animals, they always cause something bad to go wrong rather than something good. To give you one good example of that, you know, have you ever seen an albino squirrel? That's caused by mutation. Just as white as can be. Now is that, and they say, and then, 100,000 years later, he's going to have another mutation. Rather than change his color, it's going to add wings to him. And then after another 100,000 years, you're going to have another mutation, and he'll drop his legs and get a beak on him. And on and on and on, these mutations. But you see, that's getting better and better. They're trying to go from a squirrel or whatever all the way up to a human. That's getting better and better. Mutations don't do that. Mutations always go down. They're always regressive, in other words, rather than progressive. Albino squirrel, beautiful thing when he's white, but you know what? He lost his natural coloring to protect him in the wild. You don't want to be a white squirrel. You want to be a gray one, or a fox squirrel. Of course, that's a red squirrel, because you can hide better then. There are such things as mutations. Of course, that's controlled by the genes when you have a malfunction in the genes. And of course, why did that come about? Because of the fall of man. It's because of the fall and because of the subsequent curses in Genesis 3 that were placed on man, the ground, and in effect, all of creation. We read in Romans 8 fell along with him. So we just have these things. But You don't ever have, when you have mutations in humans and you end up with, all types of weird things, no arms, no legs, you never end up with something better, like a better human, with a better heart or a better brain. You never end up with that. It's always destructive whenever it happens. So they can never claim that these changes have actually occurred by means of mutation, because mutation, 99% of the time, really you could say 100% of the time, is always defective, and it certainly is not going to do anything any good, the thing that it mutates. Fourthly, why is it, if we all evolved from the amoeba, that we still have one-celled organisms with us today? Things such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, and of course the amoeba. Why is it if we evolved from the amoeba into, we've got billions of cells in the human body, I mean billions of cells. Why is it, if that amoeba went from an amoeba to a human, that amoeba still only has one cell today? Why doesn't it have 2 or 3 or 4? It still only has one cell today. Has never changed whatsoever. Another flaw with the evolutionary theory and thought is that humans can only think with a concept of age, or to say it another way, humans can only think with a concept of beginning and ending. It's the only concept, friends, that we are able to think of, unless we have the Word of God revealed supernaturally to us, to be able to think into another realm. Humans are built in such a way that the only way they can think, the only concept they have is the concept of age. And as soon as you say age, you've got a concept of beginning, then of progress, and then of ending. You say, someone asks you, how old are you? I'm 42. My child's 20. My car's 11 years old. My house is 5 years old. My dog is 8 months. My little fish in the aquarium is 6 weeks. On and on and on, everything you think of. How long have you had this? How long has this been in here? This, everything in here, we can put an age to it. Now, you might not know the age, but everything in here, everything you own has an age to it. It had a beginning, it goes through progression, and it ends somewhere, somehow. Now, again, with the design and the designer, the same type of logic behind this, why is it when we go to the world, we can say the world had no beginning? Matter has been co-eternal and coexistent with God. That goes against everything that we know, that we've ever experienced in our life, and it goes against everything we see out there in the world today. We always see everything has a beginning, it progresses, and it always has an end to it. And that's why I said the only way that we can begin to conceive, not fully, but begin to conceive, of there being such a being as God is by the Word of God and by special revelation. That there is a being, a substance, howbeit a spiritual substance, that never had a beginning. The only way you can even begin to conceive of that is to begin to study the Scriptures just in that one particular area. Psalm 90 and verse 2, Micah 5 and verse 2, all the other Scriptures that say that God never had a beginning, therefore He doesn't have an age. You see, you can't, that's the question they always warn you to watch out from your kids. Well, how old is God? Why does He ask that? He's a human. The only concept He has is the concept of age. He knows He had a beginning. He knows that He got His little puppy on a certain day. It had a beginning there. That dog just wasn't there from all eternity. It began on a certain day. And therefore, a little child, until he's taught, the only thing he can think of is, well, how old is God then? If you tell him that there's a big God up there and He's got a long beard, and He walks with a cane, well, how old is that fellow then? Have to tell him, he doesn't measure in age because He had never had a beginning. And if you never had a beginning, it's more or less, I hate to use this example, but like a circle. A circle doesn't have a beginning anywhere. Doesn't end anywhere either. You can pick out and try to find, I think it began right here. No, didn't have a beginning anywhere. If you watch your piece of paper when you put your point down and then draw around, then you know where you started. But where's the beginning of that circle? It doesn't have a beginning anywhere. It doesn't have an end anywhere. If you draw a straight line, you've got a beginning, you've got progression, continuance, you've got an end over here at this side, but not with a circle. Another thing we can say, the missing links in the fossil record have never been solved. That's why we had to give you the theory earlier by the Harvard professor, Stephen Jay Gould, of punctuated equilibrium, because he had to come to the conclusion himself that there's no such thing as a missing link in the fossil record. We don't see men, and then we see an ape, and then we see a part ape and a part man. Not in the fossil record. We never see that anywhere. And then finally in the fossil record we see a full-grown human, or a dozen different types of birds, and then they gradually progressed on and became a cat and then became a rhinoceros or something. And all the in-between stages, such as a cat with a snout like a rhinoceros. You don't find any in-between stages. You only find everything distinct. You see a cat, a dog, rhinoceros, whatever it is you're looking for, there it is. But to go from that to another species, you never find anything in between the two things. Now, we do have such thing as extinct species. There are birds and all types of things that are extinct. But that doesn't prove anything. It just proves that they're extinct. It doesn't prove that they evolved from anything else. This is something you never will find. Again, it's like looking for the fountain of youth. Ponce de Leon could have looked and looked and looked, and he did. But you can't find something that doesn't exist. This is something they need to understand. Like I said earlier, you can't believe in something that's not true. You can think it all you want to, but you can't believe in something that's not true. You can search and search and search, but you can't find something that doesn't exist. What number are we on? Seventhly? There is not a single example of evolution taking place today anywhere. Now, the one I gave you before is we don't see it in the fossil record. What I'm saying here is that nowhere in the world do you see evolution in process. Just go back to that one example. A cat with a snout like a rhinoceros. You don't see that. You don't see any in-between stages. Why is it that we just happen to be in a particular time period when everything's complete? I mean, that's about all they could say is, well, we happen to be in that little small time period of those many billions of years where everything happens to be complete now. And if you live for the next million years, then you'll see some changes. Well, see, they're just saying that. They can't prove that, though. And if so many things have evolved, of course, they say everything has evolved. If that many, hundreds of thousands of different species of plants and animals and all types of things, if these things have really evolved, then surely one of them would be in the process right now. So we could just actually see one of these things. So we can actually see a man that was really part of a monkey. We ought to be able to find one of those somewhere around today. But you won't find any of those things there. And any of their alleged examples simply show they don't know the diversity that God began with in Genesis by creating a great diversity of things. What about a flying squirrel? I shot one. We have them mounted at home, or at my parents' home. Now, of course, you know a flying squirrel doesn't have wings on him, but he's got that little extra skin on him, and he can do what other squirrels can't do, or they can really do it. They're such jumpers. You shoot them out of a tree, and you just know you've got them, and they fall 100 feet out of the tree and hit that ground. Of course, you'd smash to pieces and take off running as soon as he hits the ground there. Now, if he's a flying squirrel, and you shoot him out of a tree, or if you don't shoot him, if you just go and watch him, go up to the very tip top of a tree, hop off of that tree, open up his four little legs. He's got a pouch of skin that connects the two front and the two back, and there he goes, just what they call flying. Really all, of course, he's doing is gliding, but there he goes to the ground. And they say, well, you know, it's going to change into a bird before too long. There's one of the examples of a transition stage. No, a flying squirrel is just a flying squirrel. Just because he's not like a fox squirrel doesn't mean that he's some other species, a subspecies, or even advanced species that's going to change into a bird now, he's still just what he is. Or what about a snake that has legs on him, little tiny legs, little tiny feelers on him, like most snakes don't have? See, they'll give you hundreds of examples that they've gone to Timbuktu and tried to discover some rare animal over there and prove to naive people back in the United States, because we don't live in Timbuktu and have these wild animals, that, oh, this must be one of those transitional stages there. Don't believe them. Whatever it is, that's just the way God intended for it to be. Eighthly, vestigial organs are common in nature. This is something they'll always bring up to you. I've seen many, many times in books. They'll talk about the vestigial organs. Are common in nature, but nascent ones are never found. This is one of their strong arguments concerning vestigial and nascent organs. Now, a vestigial organ is an organ on an animal or on a human that appears to have served its purpose in evolution and is on the way out. That's a vestigial organ. Vestigial, V-E-S-T-I-G-I-A-L. Nascent, N-A-S-C-E-N-T. Now, if that's what a vestigial organ is, then a nascent one is just the opposite. It's an organ that's just beginning to develop. It's on the way in other words, in the process of evolution. Whereas a vestigial organ is an organ that's on the way out. And they attribute, and of course, as I said, we've never found a nascent organ. And there are some examples of what they call vestigial organs. Rudiment organs. They are just remains of something that existed before. Such as flightless birds.
For the continuation of this message,